We welcome you with open arms, as this is an issue that the Unitarian Universalist Association and our particular congregation feel very strongly about. The association, the General Assembly of Unitarian Universalist Congregations, has voted 12 statements of conscience over the last 20 years asking for criminal justice reform, requesting it, demanding it, based on our principles of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Those are our first two principles. So we're very honored to be a part of this evening, a co-sponsor, and we welcome you. I do have a couple of housekeeping announcements. There is in the back this clipboard with a constitutional amendment petition form for voting restoration rights here in Florida for those felons who have served their time and now would like to have full citizenship but are denied that by the state of Florida. If you'd like to sign this, it'll be in the back table. Also like to bring to your attention our community read, which is two books this year, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and Waking Up White by Debbie Watson, I believe. Those are books that we're reading here in the congregation. We'll be discussing in March, so you're welcome to join us for that. Anyway, thank you very much for being here, and I'd like to introduce to you one of the organizers of this event, our own Jeff Davis. Jeff, where are you?
Tony, that was a lovely introduction because I think it speaks to the motivations that are behind this whole thing. We have an epidemic going on in this country. Criminal justice is out of control. I think most of you are aware, are way overpopulated in terms of prisoners. We have 4.5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Can you imagine? Fewer than 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. At this point in time, 1 out of every 100 American adults is in prison. 1 out of every 100. Among young black men, that's 1 out of every 9 is in prison. Can you imagine? In the state of Florida alone, we have 100,000 people in prison. And this is the panel of our authorities who are going to discuss that problem for you tonight. We have 3 very knowledgeable people about this subject, and all who are leading criminal justice reform efforts on the part of different organizations. We have Adam Bates, who flew down from Washington, D.C. today. Adam is with the Cato Institute, and he is heading up their project on criminal justice reform. Seated in the middle here is Deborah Brodsky. Deborah is a PhD professor at the University of Florida, and she is the founder of the Accountable Justice Project, which, interestingly enough, is actually a consortium between 5 major universities, and it is funded in part by all people, the Koch brothers. This effort toward criminal justice reform is a movement that is actually backed both on the left and on the right. How unusual is that in this day and age to find a common cause? And our third panelist is Adam Bates, who is our Florida Raymond McGuire. I'm sorry, I put you on the line here. Raymond McGuire, who is head of our Florida ACLU criminal justice reform effort. And when this discussion is all over, and I think you're going to learn a lot, Raymond is going to tell us what each of us can do in order to help move this effort along. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this discussion, who is Mickey Winograd, who actually was drafted at the last minute because a lot of you are aware of the fact that Casey Wolf was to have been the moderator for this, but Casey is ill today, unfortunately, so Mickey is going to step in for him. And here's Mickey.
Thank you very much. I'm like an understudy or who's going to become a star. I just know it. Remember Jack Kennedy, the president? He was elected president. First day on the job, he said, "What do I do now?" That's how I feel. Anyway, we're going to start. Each of the participants is going to have about, I don't know, 20 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes. And will speak and tell us about the criminal justice system, and then we'll take it from there. So you want to start from the far end, Adam? Adam?
That works for me.
Okay, Adam, it's all yours.
Can everybody hear me? No. Now can everybody? Good? Everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
All right, good. So first, I'd like to thank the ACLU and their partners in setting up this event, and also the congregation for hosting us. When the opportunity arose to be more than 1,000 miles away from DC for the next few days, I work in the Project on Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute in DC. I work on issues of the drug war, police militarization, civil asset forfeiture, mass incarceration, and we've taken a keen interest in criminal justice reform for a long time. We've been opponents of the drug war for a long time because we've seen the kind of deleterious effect that the drug war has on our prison population, on our societies, on our constitutional jurisprudence. And so over the past several years, it's been heartening. It's unfortunate how it came about, but over the past several years, thanks to unrest in places like Ferguson, places like Baltimore, we're having a much broader criminal justice reform conversation than we've had in the past. And it's great to have so many people from diverse backgrounds and from different sides of the aisle acknowledge that there's a problem here and get together to discuss the things that we can do to fix it, because we have to fix it. Our incarceration rate is an obscenity. It really is on a global scale. And this is we like to proclaim ourselves the freest country on earth, the land of the free. But as was mentioned, we have 1/4 of the world's incarcerated population, and that doesn't sit well with many more people today than in the past, and that's heartening, I think. My colleagues are going to discuss more Florida-specific issues with the state criminal justice system here. I thought I could give a little broader overview to show that Florida does have specific problems, but the problems in our criminal justice system are national problems. These are not isolated incidents. These are institutional problems around the country. I mentioned the drug war. The drug war is part and parcel of our fetish, basically, for incarcerating nonviolent offenders in this country, and that's one of the reasons that our incarceration rate looks like it does, because we have so many people in prison who did not commit violent crimes and are still in prison anyway. When I talk about police militarization, when I say a SWAT raid, I'm referring to police in basically paramilitary gear, flak jackets, helmets, assault rifles, kicking in people's doors at 3 in the morning, throwing everybody on the ground, throwing flash grenades, shooting the dog. Just to get an idea, how many SWAT raids do you think happen in this country every year? Any guess? 5,000? I wish it were 5,000. The best numbers we have, and this data is out of date, but the best data we have on this is somewhere between 50 and 80,000 SWAT raids. The vast majority, SWAT teams were invented for hostage situations, for active shooters, for barricaded suspects, for serious situations where routine police enforcement couldn't work. But today, the vast majority of these SWAT raids are serving search warrants. And the vast majority of these search warrants are looking for drugs. So, in furtherance of this drug prohibition, the federal government then plies state and local law enforcement with equipment, with weaponry, with funding to purchase this equipment, and you can see this problem, you can see the incentives that are created then by prohibition, and we can look at many of the problems in our criminal justice system and tie them directly back to drug prohibition. I like being a little Socratic about these things. So, plea bargains. What percentage of criminal cases in this country do you think end in plea bargains rather than trials? Somewhere between 95 and 98% of cases. So, that's one of the main points I want to get across to people who haven't interacted that much with the criminal justice system is, it is not the way you think it is. Everybody watches Law and Order, or they watch The Practice, and they think that's what our criminal justice system is, but it's not. 95% of the time, it is a guilty plea and then a negotiation on sentencing. The prosecutor doesn't have to prove their case. They don't have to submit the evidence to the judge. You just get the plea deal, and now we're having a discussion about do you want to exercise your constitutional right to go to trial, or do you want a better sentence to go home? That's the position that we put people in our criminal justice system today. And if you accept the idea that the only people who plead guilty are guilty people, that makes it okay with you. But we know that that's not true. We know that innocent people can be made to plead guilty, or in many cases, that it's perfectly rational for them to plead guilty because the lack of faith they have in the criminal justice system to give them a fair shake if they go to trial, the lack of faith they have in judges and prosecutors and jurors of their peers, makes it rational for people to plead guilty to things they didn't do. That ties right into mandatory minimums. I'm sure many of you are familiar with mandatory minimums, but there was an intense desire in the 80s and 90s to crack down on the crime wave. And we started to see this idea that judges were being too lenient and people were getting sentences that didn't quite jive. People in similar situations were getting vastly different sentences. So we started to see the proliferation of mandatory minimums, which took sentencing discretion, away from judges and juries and put it in the hands of prosecutors. What it said was, if you get convicted of X crime, you must serve at least 5 years. You must serve at least 10 years. And for many of these, a lot of mandatory minimums are used on nonviolent offenses, like drug crimes. So this takes the ability of the judge, who is best positioned to analyze the facts of the case, who has seen the evidence, who has talked to the people involved in the case. That judge now doesn't have discretion. Now that discretion has moved to the prosecutor, who decides what to charge you with in the first place. That's how this negotiation goes now, is you're negotiating with the prosecutor. I think this is especially one of the reasons I wanted to come down here and start talking to people at the state level is because, as many of you know, the new administration considers itself a law and order administration, and the new nominee for Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, has made a career out of being a law and order Attorney General that does not want the federal government meddling in state and local law enforcement. So insofar as we've been working a lot, we've worked a lot at Cato, I've worked a lot on federal criminal justice reform and efforts, for instance, in the Department of Justice to hold local police departments accountable and transparent. I think it would be reasonable to anticipate that is going to recede a bit, and a lot of this reform effort now is going to have to take place at the state level, and that's why I'm more than happy to come down here and speak with you. And so now you'll hear more about the Florida-specific issues, but I'm more than happy to take questions and hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Before I call on the next participant, I can't help, you don't know me, I'm from New Jersey. I was a criminal trial lawyer, actually, public defender, handled at least 15 death penalty cases. I spent my life in the courtroom, and I only have to mention one thing, plea bargains. Practically every trial that I had started with a plea bargain where the guy wanted to plead. And many times, more than many times actually, he was acquitted. So plea bargaining is an essential, a majority of the action is involved in plea bargaining. We can talk more about that later. Deborah, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you, I'm Deborah Brodsky. I'm actually from Florida State University, not the University of Florida. I'm not a PhD. I was a policy wonk. Been working in criminal justice for about 10 years. My organization is dedicated to advancing public safety through research and evidence, and we are a collaboration of several institutions of higher learning, including Baylor University, Florida State, as I mentioned, Tallahassee Community College, St. Pete College, and we've got board members from FAMU and also from Edward Waters College. So we are dedicated to advancing public safety here in Florida. That is a bit of a challenge. We are far behind where the rest of the country is in criminal justice reform, which is why it's great to have partners from all sides of the aisles, I guess. And I work very closely with our friends at the ACLU, SPLC, James Madison Institute, which is our market-based think tank in Tallahassee, and we all come to the same conclusion: the system is broken and needs to be fixed. And I want to give you a little grounding, sort of in the size and scale of our Department of Corrections. I think that's sort of the dumping ground of all of these problems. So I start there. We have 100,000 prisoners in the Department of Corrections, but we also have about 140,000 people who are on some form of community supervision probation. We no longer have parole, so there's a very small population of folks who were sentenced prior to our elimination of parole, and they're monitored by the Florida Commission on Offender Review. It used to be the Parole Commission. So it's a very small part of our population that's monitored. We are not only the world's largest jailer in the United States, Florida itself is an overachiever in incarceration as well. We're about 10th in the nation, 24% higher than what is the national average. So if you took our population of folks in jails and prisons, we've got another 50,000 people on any given day sitting in our local county jails, 35,000 of whom are not yet convicted, possibly never convicted, pretrial defendants. These are folks who have been arrested and booked, and for the vast majority of them probably sitting in there because they can't post their bail. So we've got a very dysfunctional system, and what we haven't done, I think, that is remarkable and sort of keeps us an outlier in the rest of the country. In fact, one of our colleagues who's from the Charles Koch Institute, Vikram Reddy, calls us the great white whale of criminal justice reform. Well, we need to stop that. We need to change that. And there's just so many places that we can make lots of changes. One of the things I wanted to talk about was just to give you a little bit better perspective on what our Department of Corrections looks like. As I mentioned, 100,000 people inside those prison walls, which is about $2.4 billion annually in our state budget, which is roughly about 9-10% of our general appropriations too. So of all the discretionary money in our state, about 10% of it goes to the Department of Corrections. We have 21,000 employees for the Florida Department of Corrections. The total state employee population in Florida is about 107. So about 1 in every 4 state employees is a Department of Corrections employee, and that's still not sufficient. We are understaffed severely with huge turnover. The average, I think, length of stay, or excuse me, the average Department of Corrections correctional officers has been, I think, 50% are there less than 2 years. They've been incredibly inexperienced, and we also have 2,500 vacancies. We've been going to other states, to Georgia, to recruit, and we can't keep people here because we pay our folks $29,000, and it's a horrible place to work. So we've got serious funding, sort of underfunding, languishing environment where we've sort of exacerbated the normal problems of prisons. Prisons are terrible places. They're dark, they are brutal in many cases, and the folks who come inside of them don't just stay inside. The activity between our institutions is very dynamic. So you've got on average 30,000 people coming in and out of the system every year. 100,000 people, 30,000 in, 30,000 out. That population, if you took, as I mentioned, the scale of it, if you took the population of the Department of Corrections, it is larger than 44 of our state's 67 counties. So basically, we're a lateral county, the Department of Corrections. And so, for years, it has languished, it has been a serious place where it hasn't been prioritized, and it is immensely fixable. There are lots of places where we can start to talk about this. I think my friends from the ACLU will have some specific recommendations, but I want to give you an idea of who's going in so we can start to talk about ways that we can adjust things. This is brand new. I've got a piece of research that's coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, but you guys are getting a little preliminary shot. So I'm going to look at 2015 admissions because I think it's better to probably look at what's going on right now. It gives you a good idea of what the population looks like. Just under 7,000 people were admitted in 2015 who were incarcerated for a violation of probation. So that's of the 30,000 people who came in last year, 7,000 were violations of probation. Another 1,358 were returned to prison for largely technical violations of parole or some other form of conditional release. So of that smaller population that I talked about, that managed population of about 5,000 people, a large percentage of those folks fail. Nearly 3/4 of people admitted to prison in fiscal year 2015 were incarcerated for a non-violent offense. Probation and prison are closely intertwined. This is part of why I talk about it as a system. It's not just the Department of Corrections, it's the community around it. It's certainly the jails as well. They're very closely intertwined. In 2015, 38% of people admitted to prison were on probation when they were sentenced to prison. The people sentenced to prison while they were on probation decreased 35% since the Department of Corrections abandoned the zero tolerance policy in 2008. So that tells you we have the opportunity through policy changes to actually change the direction, and have already successfully started to do that, but it's still not enough. And here's one that I think is probably very relevant given some recent media attention. Despite the fact that blacks and whites use drugs at very similar rates, black Floridians are 7.5 times more likely to be in prison today for a drug offense than white Floridians. So this is a problem of I think has just recently been really opened up in the eyes of the press. And Sarasota Herald Tribune did a great study that looked at some data in a very targeted way that drilled down to the judges level and showed the sort of racial disparities across the state. It's not unusual. This is happening all over the country. So we're not unusual, but it's also not an acceptable place to land. So overall, admissions have dropped in the Department of Corrections, which is a good thing. When I first started looking at this, our population was up about 103,000 people. We're down just below 100 right now, and our admissions have dropped 25%. But the prison population has consistently stayed at the same level because people get very, very, very long sentences here in Florida. In fact, there was a study done that was commissioned by the state that took a look at us in terms of sort of bang for our buck, recidivism, the result of folks who are in the prison system who come out and come back in for the same sort of offenses with similar in different states that have shorter sentences, we get the same recidivism results. So that tells us we can get the same bad results with a shorter sentence. And I think someone had asked me earlier to talk a little bit about recidivism. I want to do that also. The Department of Corrections has a well-published recidivism rate of about 26%. That is, people who are released from the Department of Corrections in the prisons that come back into the community within 3 years will go back. 26% of them will go back to the Department of Corrections institutions. That doesn't tell the whole story. So the folks who go in and then come back out within 3 years, in your community, in all the communities in Florida, it's about 69% will be rearrested within three years. So you have a very different set of that. Part of that has to do with sort of how we manage our population once it's released. Florida, again, is an outlier in terms of how many people are on probation. Not that I want to encourage it, because I think probation is seriously challenged and also understaffed and underfunded. And so I think 65% of our folks who are released from prison get released without any form of supervision whatsoever. And I caution you with that number because it isn't necessarily something we want to do more of when the system itself is not working as it should and actually supporting people as a return. We act as enforcement and not as rehabilitation, and that is a serious flaw in the system. And one of the things I think that's really sort of interesting is while we do have very long sentences for a lot of offenses that whack with what is rational, we also have this high volume of folks. About 50% of the admissions are about, they get sentenced to less than 2 years. And so there's this also high volume of people in and out, with 30,000 in and out. So a lot of those folks are there for a very short amount of time. And as a result, just the processing time and sort of the way that we manage the population when it comes inside, they don't get very much while they're there. They get very little. In fact, last I looked, it was about $1 a day per prisoner for programming. And if you take a look at our, I'm taking way too long. If you take a look at our sort of the budget pie of the Department of Corrections, the vast majority of that pie is going just to security, which, as I mentioned before, is understaffed and underfunded. And then you've got a very small portion, 10% about, that goes to probation. That's 140,000 people that are managed in our community. And then the programming is somewhere around 3% of our total pie of the $2.4 billion. So there's a lot of places where if we started to do things differently, we started to look at the population and in the hopes of really shrinking its scale to better manage the system, because it is a place where people need to go. There are places and there are people that are dangerous and need to be housed, but the vast majority of these folks we handle safely in our community for less money and to better effect.
Thank you, Deborah. In all probability, everybody in this audience, no one's been in jail, am I right? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. I recommend something that I read years ago. In fact, I used part of it in one of my trials, a ballad by Oscar Wilde called The Ballad of Reading Jail. If you want to get the feel of what it's like to be in jail, I'm going to whet your appetite and recite one stanza for you. I know not whether laws be right or whether laws be wrong. All we know that lie in jail are that the walls are strong. Each day is like a year whose days are long. Ballad of Reading Jail. Are we ready? Are you ready? Raymond, are you ready? Okay.
First, let me thank everybody for coming out tonight. I think the only way Florida passes comprehensive reforms, criminal justice reforms, is if it's a priority with voters. And seeing this room here full tonight, it really just puts a smile on my face because I know it's a priority for you. So there was one word that Deb used that really stood out in my mind, and that was outlier. Florida is not just a little backwards, it's not just kind of on the bottom end of the spectrum. It's an outlier. We send more youth, children, to adult court than any other state, and it's not even close. From 1990 to 2009, the length of prison sentences in Florida increased more than any other state in our country. They increased by 166% over a 20-year period. And it's the clearest for me when you look at the difference between Florida and New York. In 2000, both Florida and New York had approximately 70,000 people in prison. New York passed comprehensive reforms, and Florida continued to be tough on crime. Well, 15, 16 years later, Florida's prison population went from 70,000 to 100,000, and New York's went from 70,000 down to 55,000. What's amazing is that both New York and Florida saw 54% reductions in crime. Mass incarceration doesn't reduce crime. What it does is it costs our state over $2 billion a year. So I'm leading up a new campaign that the ACLU is starting. For the last 100 years, the ACLU has really fought their battles inside of the courtroom. And they're now starting a new effort through ballot initiatives, through legislative lobbying, and through public education to reform our criminal justice system. So I just real quickly want to go over some of our top priorities so that you can have a better understanding of what the ACLU is focused on and what we think would have the most effect on Florida's criminal justice system. So as I mentioned, direct file. We direct file more youth into adult court than any other state. Our short-term goal is to end mandatory direct file, and our 5-year goal is to end direct file of youth into adult court without judicial approval. We have 107 mandatory minimums in Florida. 107. In the last 20 years, 1 mandatory minimum has been reformed. Ending mandatory minimums, or at least creating a safety valve that allows a judge to use discretion and to not use mandatory minimum is one of our top priorities. Out of the 100,000 inmates in Florida prisons, over 20,000 are defined as elderly, which in the Florida Department of Corrections is over the age of 50, not what's more traditional, over the age of 65. And those inmates cost about 3 times as much to house as inmates under the age of 50. We want to expand an existing program, conditional medical release, which is currently only available to inmates over the age of 65 who have served over 50% of their sentence and have less than 12 months to live. We want to expand that to inmates that are over the age of 65, have served over half their sentence, are no longer a threat to society, and have poor or deteriorating health, but might actually have 2 or 3 years to live, or 5 or 10. We currently have a youth civil citation program that is being used just over 40% of, it's a statewide program, that's being used just over 40% of the instances that it could be used. And unfortunately, this is causing cities or counties like Miami-Dade that are a little more progressive to use it 90 or 95% of the time, and counties like Polk County, which are a little more conservative, to use it 0% of the time. What we want to do is to make it a presumption or a requirement for officers to issue youth civil citations, so that if you happen to be in this county, or you upset the officer, or you are of a different ethnicity of the officer, that it doesn't matter, that the youth will have the same opportunity. We want to create an adult civil citation program so that officers no longer have to choose between making an arrest or letting somebody off with a warning. They can now issue a civil citation, which increases revenue for the state and, of course, helps keep people out of prison and jail. We want to fight the war on drugs. Both of the panelists up here have spoken about it. I think everybody here is aware of the effect that it has had on our state. So decriminalizing marijuana and reclassifying other drugs in instances where it is for personal consumption, not trafficking, not for sale, not for distribution, personal consumption. We want to reclassify those down to misdemeanors. And lastly, we want to end truth in sentencing. In Florida, inmates have to serve 85% of their sentence. This is once again, we are an outlier. That is at the absolute highest end of the spectrum compared to the other 49 states. And it is simply keeping inmates in jail and prison for longer. But it's not reducing crime, and it's not reducing recidivism. So I'm going to get into all these priorities a little bit more as we go on, but that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Robert. I think now we moderate. Am I right there? Is that we're going now? I guess we moderate. What do you do you say, I'm gonna ask, the panel, any one of you can ask. What do you say to someone leaving aside these minor drug business, possession of marijuana and all that stuff? What do you say to a bad man, lock him up and throw the key away? What do you say to this guy? We don't want him in the community, and the place for him is in jail. That's what we have jail for. Taxpayers pay money for jail, for bad people. What's your reaction?
I would say that over 70% of Floridians believe that our criminal justice system should focus on rehabilitation, not punishment. You might fall into that 30% that wants to lock up the key and punish them, but it doesn't reduce crime and it doesn't reduce recidivism. It's not the smart way of handling our criminal justice system.
Deborah, if you could do one thing to modernize the system, broken criminal justice system, what would it be?
I would inject accountability throughout the whole system. So all the things that we're talking about, these pieces of data, have been hidden in the same way the prisoners have been hidden for years and years and years in darkness. And once these things come to light and people start to realize how much it really does impact them directly, it changes everything. So sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, accountability across the system, and I mean for all actors. I don't mean just, as we've talked about, prosecutorial accountability is hugely important, particularly in this issue of children tried as adults. They hold all the cards. And a lot of what happens goes behind closed doors. And it's that kind of activity that we have trusted for too long without just even asking questions about what that meant. And in terms of sort of the system, we've spent 40 years ratcheting up all of our prisons and never really looked back to see, was it working? How much was it working? And now we're starting to ask those questions with data, transparency, and accountability. And that's why we're having these conversations now. Because it costs a lot of money. $80 billion a year in our country.
80 billion here, 80 billion there, before you know you're talking about real money. Just a joke. Adam, you mentioned plea bargains and so forth. What do you think of the value of pre-trial intervention programs like they have in some states, whereby someone goes in, pleads guilty, and if she's good for a year, there'll be no record. What's your view on that kind of procedure?
I think that's better than the status quo, but you still have this underlying problem of people being incentivized, extorted, depending on your point of view, away from exercising their constitutional rights. To me, if our criminal justice system is going to mean anything, and that gets into the first question that Raymer answered, what are we trying to do here? What is the purpose of this criminal justice system? And it cannot just be to punish people that we're mad at, which is currently pretty much our operating principle of criminal justice. So I do not want to incentivize people to plead guilty if they don't think they're guilty, just because it's a better deal if they plead guilty. So I would still have that concern. I would still have the concern of when you plead guilty, when you don't go to trial, the government can use evidence against you that would not be admissible to trial, because you don't have the process to decide whether this evidence is admissible. It's easy to overcome the will, to use a legal term, to overcome the will of an innocent person and get them to plead guilty. I fully support programs that will keep people out of prison and allow them to, if they have good behavior, to wipe their record. But I would still express concerns about the principle itself of incentivizing people to plead guilty under conditions where they actually don't think they're guilty, but it's the best deal to say they did it and take their punishment.
Well, you don't think it's unusual for someone who's innocent to plead guilty to avoid a long prison term, do you?
No, I
not unusual at all. Happens every day, wouldn't you say?
Yep.
Can you imagine if we're going to give you 20 years to 30 years in jail, and the guy says he's innocent. However, if you plead guilty, we'll give you 6 months. What do you think that kid is gonna do? Happens every day. That's leverage by the state. It happens every day. That's the way it is. Okay, let's go on. A question for the entire panel. How did we get to this point in this broken criminal justice system where we are now? How is it that we find ourselves in this situation? Any one of you?
Well, since the microphone's already over here. So I think it's best to understand this. I don't think anybody ever sat down. This is not a centrally planned effort. This is a multitude of different aspects of criminal justice policy that have come together in this kind of mosaic of over-criminalization and over-incarceration. I do think, not to beat a dead horse, but I do think the ramping up of the drug war in the 60s and 70s led to a lot of this, and there's a strong correlation between increased drug enforcement and the increase in the incarceration rate. I think we don't exactly know entirely why crime happens and why it stops happening. So in the 80s and early 90s, there was a large spike in crime, and you saw the response that you would expect from our political system, which was to freak out, talk about super predators, start throwing everybody in prison. We have to save our children, we have to save everyone from the super predators, since that time, the incarceration rate has dropped precipitously across the country. Violent crime has been dropping for 25 years in this country. And to listen to the rhetoric today of opposition to reform, you would think that today is the most violent time in American history, the most criminal time. That is not true. We have been getting better at this for 25 years, even far beyond the point where throwing people in prison, we know that is a point of diminishing returns, and we have far exceeded that. So, but there's no lobby for criminals. Nobody wants to be soft on crime. Nobody wants to let people out of prison and then take the risk that one of those thousands of people does something horrible and has that come back to you. So it's an incentives question. And I'll go to what Raymer started with, which is fundamentally, if we're going to have serious fundamental reform, we have to change the way people look at the criminal justice system, and voters have to stop just caring about getting the bad guy and start asking themselves what the purpose of this system is and asking whether we're accomplishing that. And I don't think anyone can say our criminal justice system is accomplishing any lofty goal that they can come up with.
As a concrete matter, what can you do, if anything, when, for example, there's a bad law? You know, some states have 3 strikes and you're out. 1, 2, and the third one he stole, actual cases. He steals a DVD or something, and it's a felony, and he's doing life imprisonment. What can you do to change things like that? All 3 of you.
Come to meetings like this and bother your local policymakers. I mean, good politics is based in good policy. And now we know what works, we know what isn't working, we know the places where we've done a terrible job and have forgotten our responsibility as citizens. And criminal justice is that place right now. It's our responsibility. Again, I'm going to reiterate this point. It touches all of us. Whether or not you've had somebody in the system, you know somebody who's been in the system. And if you haven't, you're probably living next door to someone who has been. And it affects all of us. All of these things that come inside and outside of prison affect our culture too. The same problems that you see in communities where incarceration is the norm go back and forth into prison, and we're raising children that only understand this as their reality. This is all of our problems. So I think you're belonging to groups like the ACLU, you're supporting the work of groups like Cato Institute and my group at Project on Accountable Justice. These are important things, but they need to hear from you.
Raymond, you were going to say something, right?
Hey, I want to build off that. These changes are going to take place in Tallahassee. Your representatives want to get reelected. If they never hear their constituents say this is a priority, then they're going to think it's not a priority. And they're not going to risk upsetting their constituents, not getting reelected, getting bad press, and passing a law that they don't think you want. So be vocal and be visible and contact your representatives and let them know that criminal justice reform is your top priority.
Okay. Changing gears a bit, Deborah, you mentioned about recidivism rates, and we know that recidivism rates are very bad. What do we need to do to get inmates prepared for what they will face when they get out? And what do we need to help them when they get out?
So there's a couple of things. Obviously, not putting folks into prison who do not need to be there is the best recidivism reduction program in the world. And so we know that just being in jail for a very short period, someone who's in pretrial detention, immediately they cycle into sort of dysfunction. If you are someone who is living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, and you have a family, and you get arrested, and you get booked into jail, and you can't pay your bail, within a very short period of time, your life is going to completely unravel, which further exacerbates your likelihood of being involved in more criminal activity, if you were ever involved. And more importantly, classification and sort of how we structure our prison system itself. As I mentioned, there are folks that are probably there for public safety reasons. Once we acknowledge that, how do we handle them, and what are we doing? And in terms of sort of that sorting out process, mass incarceration means we treat everybody as if they're the worst, and we throw them all in a dungeon. If we stop doing that and really refine the sort of methods by which we sort and by which we actually address individual needs, we're going to do ourselves a big favor, right? We're going to have better results. The other problem that I think that we haven't mentioned, obviously, the war on drugs is a huge issue. Substance abuse is a huge social issue. Does it need to be addressed in our jails and prisons? Probably not. Mental health. This is really a shameful part of our society right now. That Florida has such a low. I think we're like 49th lowest funding per capita in the country in mental health. And so as a result, the only the largest mental health institutions in our community are our jails. And that is not a place that you want to put somebody who's having a serious crisis. So all the places that we know we're doing things poorly, we can readjust. We also need to support our community efforts. When someone is returned, after they've served their time, there's a lot of collateral consequences that we've talked about briefly, sort of employment restrictions. The inability to participate fully in society leaves you with a stain that is, I mean, how can you function as a member of society if you've been completely discarded by the society, even though you've paid your dues? So lots of places where we aren't doing a good job. And our communities, our churches, do a really good job, I think, of supporting folks behind the prison walls where it's safe and comfortable, but welcoming people into your congregation and helping them readjust to life outside prison is incredibly important. The dysfunction of the system is so bad that we put people in there and treat them as children. We take away all of their responsibility, all of their accountability, and we expect them to come out better as a result of it. So the support that we do when people are returning is incredibly important.
Thank you. We know that there's support from both the political left and the political right to these criminal justice reform positions. And do these positions come from the same concerns? How are they different? And the second part of the question is, what do we have to do in order to get them to work together? Anyone? Yes.
So I have worked for many years as sort of the central hub of a couple of state coalitions that work from all sides. The thing that we rally around is data. So if we're armed with information that includes things like this is how much it costs, and this is how much we know this is damaging our communities, we can rally around things because we all believe we want to make it a better place to live. We come at it from different places. We look at it from different from different perspectives, but the idea that the right and the left understand that it's dysfunctional is very clear. We all nod our heads. I'm usually sitting in the middle, and this is exactly probably the right perspective. This has been going on for years, and in juvenile justice we've done a marvelous job of this, and now we're starting to embrace it, I think, at the state level for adult reform as well. They need to hear from the folks who voted them in, right? It's the same people. So the perspectives matter less than the importance and the prioritization of this as someplace that has been neglected for too long. But I think we all come at it from the perspective that it can be fixed. It's very expensive, and the consequences for communities and families is huge.
Thank you. A different topic, privatization of the jail system. We haven't discussed that. Good thing or bad thing?
I have a feeling everybody on this panel would say it's a bad thing. I think you consistently see private prisons ineffectively run. They don't provide the level of education, they don't provide the level of security and safety, and they need to be ended in Florida.
I'm going to disagree. I don't want to disagree on this, and I'm not going to say that I prefer a private prison. I think we need to shrink the system and then start to really measure and understand better what is working. In Florida, frankly, the private prisons are nicer places, if you've been to one. They're air conditioned. We're going to get the lower levels, the higher security folks go to the public prisons. They are contractually obligated to maintain certain standards. In fact, they've got to give 70% of their inmates programming. As I already told you, that's not happening in the public system. So I think the dysfunction of the system hasn't allowed us to have that. But I will place a caveat on this. We have incentivized the wrong thing altogether. We have incentivized a system that is designed to grow and not to shrink. And it's the same for the unions as it is for the private prisons. If you try to close a prison, you're going to get a public prison, you're going to get possibly things like your trash rifled through at your house and those sorts of things. The unions are very powerful, and in some communities, the only real employment opportunity comes from the prison. So the dysfunction, we have not asked the system itself what it is that we wanted from it. We have simply said we're warehousing, and so policymakers have made the decision, probably with very little study, to just go ahead and try and privatize it like we've done everything. But I maintain that we don't really understand the system. It's designed to grow, and until we actually determine what it is that we want from it, we shouldn't be doing anything.
Should I take a crack at that?
Yes.
I would not say that private prisons are a good thing, but I also don't think they're inherently a bad thing. I think different jurisdictions, it's an empirical question, and you just have to go place by place and see. But I think a lot of the anti-private prison argument is about the incentives and the perverse incentives created by private prisons. But I'll echo Deb's point and say the public prison system has perverse incentives. It's not just the for-profit prisons, it's the prison guard unions that have incentives. It's the police and the prosecutors and the judges and the politicians who have perverse incentives. So the private prisons can only put people in jail that have broken the law, and if you want to lessen the incentives to operate private prisons, then you need to change the laws and make sure that people aren't going to prison who shouldn't be there in the first place. So in some circumstances, the perverse incentives on private prisons are going to make those prisons worse than the public prisons. In other situations that Deb brought up, sometimes the private prisons may be better than the public prisons. So it's not, to me, the public versus private debate about prison is not a philosophical question about which of these is better. Both sets of prisons have perverse incentives, and it just depends on, in a particular jurisdiction, which group is responding more poorly to those incentives. Listening and the little dispute we have here at the table,
when you say it's good and it's bad and it's yes, and it reminds me of a story about a guy who goes on a date with Siamese twins. And they said to him, well, how was it? Was it good? He says yes and no. You ever been going on this and said, I'm pretty clear on it myself, I disagree.
Some perspective, I think, just in terms of how much privatization is in Florida. All of our healthcare is 100% privatized, and we can talk about that. We can have a whole separate panel on that. But there are only 7 facilities that are privatized. So they house roughly 11% of our Department of Corrections. And all of our county jails are run by the sheriffs or the county themselves.
Okay, thanks. In my personal view, I think it's a bad thing to have a businessman with the incentive to keep the jail full to make more money. And that's how I would come down on it. But I recognize the other parts. Okay, another question. Are there policies that you have access to in the current system that you that we're not currently working on? In other words, the system is not dealing with it. There's policies there that they can use, but they discard it and they don't use it. Is it a clear question? Yeah.
I think bail is one place that we have yet to actually have a state conversation on, and it affects people so dramatically, so quickly as I described. So someone who's arrested and sent and put into a jail, vastly different situation. If you have money, you get out, and it doesn't matter if you're a dangerous person or not, you get out, and that is a fundamentally flawed part of the system. And I think it exacerbates people's problems very quickly and in extreme. We've got lots of studies now that show sort of the differences between somebody who's equally treated and has money and stays in. They're sentenced more likely to be sentenced, more likely to be sentenced for longer terms. All the things that will down the road we will all pay for in that front door place are definitely not being addressed in bail.
I would, first, I agree absolutely with bail. That's kind of the elephant, a little bit of an elephant in a room that nobody talks about, but a huge portion of the people in jail today they haven't gone to trial yet. Some people do years. You may know the story of Khalif Browder. If you're not familiar with the story, you should look it up. But he did, I think, more than 2 years in Rikers Island in New York on suspicion of stealing a backpack. He never went to trial. He just couldn't afford the bail to get out of jail. So he spent two plus years in this hellhole of Rikers Island, and they eventually dropped the charges. So he never went to trial. He went home and unfortunately took his own life based on what had happened to him in jail. But there are stories like this all over the system, and the purpose of bail is to ensure that the person shows up on trial. A great majority of the people in prison are in jail who can't make bail right now. They maybe never left their community or never left the state. It's not like they have a villa in France that they're going to escape to. They're not flight risk, and many of these people are not flight risk, and many of them are in for nonviolent offenses, so they're not some threat to the society in the first. So we certainly need to talk about bail. And I mentioned before, I think we should discuss a lot more about plea bargain reform. People like to say that if we make it harder for plea bargains, or if we abolish plea bargains, that will grind the justice system to a halt. But the assumption underlying that is that prosecutors would still behave the same way if they had to take every single case to trial, if they had to do the evidence and do the investigation and do the work. I think what we would find, and there's some evidence of this in places like Alaska that have experimented with doing away with plea bargaining, at least at an administrative level, is prosecutors become more judicious about what they charge. Now they know they can hit you with the big charge and get you to plead to something smaller because you're afraid of the risk of going to trial. If they cannot plead you out, if they have to go to trial, they can't do that. They can't make the huge extortive charge, because then they'd have to go in front of a judge and prove it and explain and explain this to a judge and jury. So bail and plea bargains would be my two that those are a huge part of our criminal justice system, and they're not a big enough part of the reform conversation.
Yes, Raymond?
One that stands out in my mind is civil citations. So we have youth civil citations across the entire state. We have 25 counties that are using them 0% of the instances that they can. We have 12 counties and cities that have passed adult civil citation programs, and Broward County stands out in my mind because it took them 10 months after passing an adult civil citation program and implementing the adult civil citation program to issue the first civil citation. So for 10 months they were arresting people for possession of marijuana, they were arresting people for stealing something that was worth $10 or $20, arresting 19 and 20-year-olds for possession of alcohol. And so in many counties and cities, we have these programs, they're simply just not being used.
Each one of you, this question, what do you think the one thing it would be that completely breaks down the criminal justice system? One thing. Like the bonfire of the vanities, remember the movie and the book? A complete breakdown. What would it take?
Political will. In this state, we have been sitting on sort of the cusp of real reform for several years. We need a groundswell of support to push it over the edge. If you look at the states and you look at a map of our country right now, and you look at places that have actually sat down, made a decision, and are changing the trajectory of their criminal justice systems, this is the outlier problem again. Florida is an island in this huge country, and we are losing ground as a result of it. And I think having the one single sort of look, states all over the country have made significant changes and are actually changing that trajectory, and they're showing that reduction in incarceration and crime can happen faster than places that don't reduce their incarceration. And so when we know that the sort of the one quality they all share, they do different policies because all of our criminal justice systems are completely different. Our bail systems are different. Our even who gets sent to the prison system is different. Our sentencing structures are different. The one unifying thing is that everyone got together and decided to do a real deep dive into the prisons and the surrounding systems of the criminal justice system at large, and start to look at the drivers and start to experiment and measure and really quantify the changes and understand what's actually happening. We haven't done that, and we need support to do that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Raymond.
I think it would take our legislators following the data and facts. I bet every representative in Tallahassee would say, I want to reduce the amount of money we spend, and I want to reduce crime. If you could save money and reduce crime, why would you not do it? Well, we have clear data from 30 other states that have done comprehensive reforms that it is possible for us to reduce recidivism, reduce crime, and save money at the same time. But our representatives are simply not following the data and facts.
One thing I would say is, this is kind of a cop-out, I guess, but time. I think younger people have better access to data than previous generations have had. They have a better understanding of the kinds of problems in our criminal justice system. They can watch. They don't have to take anybody's word for police brutality. They don't have to take anybody's word that the criminal justice system is not treating people fairly, especially communities of color. The data that I've seen says that millennials, younger people, are better about the drug war. They're better about policing issues. They have a much firmer grasp. They have much more empathy, it seems, for for not seeing people in other communities as the other. It's a much more socially integrated generation. So I don't know, ask your kids, ask your grandkids, and start listening to them. So I do think there is some cause for hope in that. I think that a lot of this is, a lot of policy issues are generational, and I think criminal justice policy in America is one of these policies where generations from now, we're going to look back at this time in our criminal justice system and say, what the hell were we doing, and why? Why didn't none of this make sense? How could 2.2 million people in America be in prison? And I do think that's going to happen. I am hopeful about that, but I will echo what Raymer said, and our Deb said, that this is a political will problem. That's what has to change. It's not politically convenient or expedient to be a criminal justice reformer, and the only way that changes is if the people change the incentives for their representatives in government.
You mentioned 2 million people incarcerated in the United States. Isn't there very little that you can do about it? Each state has its own laws. Each state has its own rules. Each state can do whatever it likes, so long as it does not violate the Bill of Rights and constitutional laws. Isn't that so? So aren't you really much restricted to acting on a state-by-state basis and not on a universal America basis?
Well, I mean, we have a federal system, so there's about 200,000 people that are housed in that system. But yeah, the vast majority of folks are housed in our state criminal justice system.
90%, right? 90% in states.
And so, 2 million, whatever it is. Anyway, the idea that we are, again, I think there's a little bit of peer pressure too. Think about it as an economic opportunity that we're missing, right? You've got 100,000 people behind bars that are costing us $2.4 billion. That's money we're not spending on other things that would make our state a healthier place. There's a bit of peer pressure here that we're missing out on. Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, our biggest competitor, right? The place that we always look to for a comparison. We aren't keeping up with our fellow states, and so we're going to see the longer term consequences of that the longer we wait to do this. So I think the political will needs to include a message that says we want Florida to remain this healthy tourist destination, retirement place that it is, that is safer than the other states around us.
Anybody else? Okay, you've hypothetical here. Each one of you take it. You've just been elected criminal justice reformer with an unlimited budget. What 2 things would you do as a priority? Tough one.
Do the budget thing, because I don't think throwing money at a problem is the solution. So thank you for the budget. I would like to reinvest in places where I know it works. There's definitely places we know that we need more investment. Mental health, substance abuse, community level, because that's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, you've got jails with people cycling in and out, low level folks. And I want to put robust data systems in place, so that we know what's going on, so that we're able to compare. One of the great, we've talked about civil citation, we haven't really talked about what it was, but it's basically a processing where if a kid gets in trouble for a stupid thing that when I was a kid, we might have gotten well, my dad's in the audience, so I'm not going to tell you what he did. The first time my dad's ever seen public speak, hey Dad, I was a well-behaved child. But a lot of the things that I did as a teenager would have gotten me locked up now. And as a result, we've changed sort of the way we handle kids who do these stupid things. And if you get caught smoking pot in most counties now, you're going to be offered an opportunity to a little injection of accountability and a little bit of fear in you and the right sort of processing. You're going to get out of that without an arrest, and that is hugely important. And so I think I've lost my train of thought because I'm thinking about my dad and being a teenager. I'm sorry, Dad.
I really just want to second that. If I had an unlimited budget, I would be focusing on mental health and drug rehabilitation. We treat drugs like a crime, and it's a health issue. And locking somebody up for 2 years for being addicted to a drug is not going to help them.
You can probably guess, but I would say I went into drug war first and foremost, just because I think so many elements that we've discussed here today, and so many other elements that we haven't even discussed, like civil asset forfeiture abuse, constitutional jurisprudence, Fourth Amendment privacy issues, all of these are bundled up in the war on drugs. I think that is the most acute representation of our far too militant approach to what, as Raymer and Deb have said repeatedly, is a social problem or a mental health problem. We have a military solution to a social issue, and that is not healthy. It's bad policy, and the results of that bad policy are all around us. It's in our law, it's in our society, it's in this room here tonight. So I would start with the drug war. After that, I have a lot of things competing for a second, but I really might go after plea bargains. I think people should take their day in court. They should have their day in court, and the government should have to prove the charges against them instead of getting them to admit to doing something little by threatening to punish them for something big, and incentivizing people to take that deal whether they actually did it or not.
Adam, how did that work in Alaska, where there was no plea bargains?
Well, so it wasn't, to my recollection, this was not a state law that forbid plea bargains. It was basically the decision of certain district attorneys within their own DA's office to say we're not going to offer pleas anymore. And what happened is it did not grind the justice system to a halt. As I said, it just seemed like those cases where the person is not accused of something very serious, but it may fit the elements of a very serious crime. So this is a perfect case for a prosecutor to threaten a big charge, but to actually get you to plead down to the lesser charge. And the lesser charge that you're pleading down to is actually what you were guilty of, probably. But because the prosecutor could generate leverage through the plea bargaining system, they got you to plead guilty when otherwise you might have gone to trial. And in that case, maybe you win at trial, or maybe the prosecutor decides that this is such a low-level offense that it's not worth going to trial, and there's another way to handle this. So it was not, the system didn't burn down, it did not grind the gears to a halt. Everybody survived.
That's what I was going to ask. The conventional wisdom is if there's no 90-95% plea bargains, the system will collapse. And I'm wondering how Alaska met that issue.
Well, so like I said, the system didn't collapse.
It worked. The system worked.
Yeah, everybody survived. It still has a justice system in Alaska.
We have come to the end of the moderation and talks by these three great speakers, but the fun is about to begin because all of you have some cards where you can put your questions down, and we'll bring them up here. And we have microphones. Do we not, Gary? We have microphones.
I've got a microphone here. If you have questions written down, okay. If you have questions written down, pass them to the middle, and I'll pick them up. In the meantime, we'll start with questions.
I would suggest for us to act as citizens in this, we provide too much, because if we're going to contact our representatives, we have to boil this down into something. I think this is an example of something that is effective. By filling this out, I've truly voted. And this actually might give you ammunition to get something done. If you can do more of this, where you can supply the individual with something like this, explaining exactly what you should do, who you should contact, and what you should say, and you can put a parenthesis there and say, well, put it in your own words, so he doesn't hear the same thing. Or I suggest that this would be a very more practical and effective way of getting change.
I think that's probably a good idea, and I believe that Raymer, at the end of this discussion, is going to speak to the things that each one of us can do. Questions? Yeah.
Harold. Very good. Usually we have a problem. How do we solve that problem? Well, the problem is people that look like me. How do we reach them to change their mind about the things that they do? Even under the threat of long incarceration, talking to people on the block, talking to people in the jail. How do we stop this from perpetuating it on and on and on? Because nothing has worked. Whether it's been in other states or this state, there's still the problem that folks keep wanting to do bad things. So what is your idea to help them help themselves?
I'm going to say what I've said quite a few times tonight. You focus on rehabilitation, not punishment. When you incarcerate someone and you don't help them further their education, you don't help them further their opportunities of employment, and then they get released and they can't find jail, they can't find housing, it is just a cyclical, you're shaking your head.
I don't want them in there in the first place. Right. If they don't go there, then you don't have that problem. You have to worry about rehabilitation. Now, how do we keep them from even getting there?
Sentencing reform, expanding diversion programs, expanding civil citation programs, and we stop criminalizing every other activity.
Community support, churches, families, while all this is going on, I mean, obviously there's going to be a time lapse between making changes and actually doing it. We have to do all of it. We have to support one another and understand that these long-term implications aren't going to be fixed. It took us 40 years to get where we are now. I don't want to wait 40 years. I don't have 40 years to wait. But I do think it's going to take some time.
Yeah, I certainly echo your sentiment that the best solution to this problem is not to have them go in the first place. And there, I think it's pretty simple to look at our criminal code and ask ourselves why we think putting people in cages is the solution to so many problems. This is what distinguishes us from that. And certainly the collective wisdom of the American people can come up with better things to do for people that commit low-level, nonviolent offenses than putting people in prison and have them whiling away the most productive years of their lives, being infantilized, having no agency, having no responsibilities. It's ludicrous. There are, as Deb said, there are people who should be in prison because they're a threat to people in society. That's fine, but that is not what our criminal justice system does. That's not who's in prison. So the best way is a serious look at our statutory law and a rethinking of under what circumstances somebody should be put in a cage for any extended period of time.
Oh, right here.
Okay, I'm going to ask them because they can't read my writing. Whether it's poor black kids with crack or marijuana or white kids with meth and now opiates, David Simon says, the system is warehousing surplus labor, and that is the point of the system, to get the surplus labor out. Do you agree with that?
Well, I have to see more about David Simon created The Wire.
Yes,
everyone should watch The Wire. I highly recommend The Wire. We certainly are aware that our prison system certainly is a warehouse. We certainly are warehousing people. I don't know that I can speak to the idea that this is some effort to affect the labor market. I do think I can say from an economic point of view, it's a very bad idea and very counterproductive to have productive labor sitting in cages doing nothing with its time. So then these people are not productive members of society. They're not paying taxes. They're not contributing to our wealth in society, and they're a drain on the tax system because the taxpayers have to pay for this, and they have to pay for the guards in the prison and the pittance that they pay for mental health provision. So it certainly is a warehouse, and it shouldn't be. As far as the idea that this is the purpose is to capture the surplus of labor, I don't know about that.
Okay. Adam, what is your recommendation for reducing drug trafficking?
I don't know that we should reduce drug trafficking. I think we should stop treating it as a criminal justice issue. During alcohol prohibition, what was our solution to stop alcohol trafficking? Well, we legalized it. And now, instead, when two alcohol distributors have a dispute, they settle it in court with lawyers, or they settle it on TV in commercials. In 1929, if two alcohol distributors had a dispute, they settled it with Tommy guns and Molotov cocktails. I mean, it's funny, but it's true. That is what prohibition did. That is what black markets do to people. It's what they do to society. So drug trafficking is not the problem. A militarized, prohibitive response to drug trafficking is the problem. People for all of human history choose to use mind-altering substances. This is something that has been with us forever. It will always be with us. So if our attitude is that is so bad and unacceptable that people would alter their state of mind, that we have to respond to this with massive violence and incarceration, we're just gonna keep seeing these same problems over and over again. So I don't have a plan to reduce drug trafficking. I have a plan to reduce the violence created by trying to prohibit drug trafficking.
Amen.
Do adult citations go on a person's record?
So we currently do not have an adult civil citation statewide program. From my understanding of the 12 local cities and counties that have done it, it does not stay on, you do not have a criminal record for receiving a civil citation.
Deborah, what statute in Florida accounts for the majority of incarceration of young people under the age of 21? Can this law be readily changed?
That's a good question. I mean, I think overall, I could break down the system. Lots of property offenses, lots of low-level drug offenses. Not usually the violence that you think about. So the vast majority, although our civil citation processing has reduced that significantly too. I think our delinquency is down like 34% over the last 5 years, in large part as a result of this civil citation processing, which will allow a kid up to 3 bites of the apple now, where if they get in trouble and it's a low-level misdemeanor, they're able to get out of it if they abide by the rules of the civil citation and leave without an arrest.
This is a 3-part question, Deborah. This is for you again. You're popular today.
My dad said he visited me.
I'm going to break it down a little. Why are more blacks likely to be jailed than whites?
Nice, easy question, Dad. I am being punished for my adolescence now. No, I'm just kidding. I've actually thought a lot about it recently with this press, and certainly there are places in the system where it is inescapable. Implicit bias is a part of our criminal justice system. So the idea that we treat people differently unconsciously is a large part of it. Policing practices themselves are also, drug, and I think Adam can talk about this probably more than me, but drug policing is based on a model where in certain communities it's easier to access folks, right? So if your model of drug dealing is on the street corner, you're easier to arrest, I'm going to go there. Again, these are perverse incentives. We've never asked the system to say, what do we want out of it other than arresting people and putting them in jail? If we really wanted public safety to be the driver, we should have asked a different question. In this case, it's easy access. Different communities function differently. White people do a lot of pot smoking too, but they do it behind closed doors and behind gates and with harder access, and frankly, they probably don't want to be bothered, and they don't want their sheriff showing up at their door. So there's a lot of places, and in every part of the criminal justice system, that part has been exacerbated by what is implicit bias, what are practices, common practices, and again, I think the idea that we monitor it more carefully and measure it and understand it better is going to change those practices also. I think all the things that we easily fall into are also things that we could be much more conscious of, aware of, and transparent about.
Deborah, what is Florida's rate of recidivism versus the nation's, and why?
So, again, we have completely different systems across the country, so it's very hard. It's an apples to oranges comparison in many places. The standard measure of recidivism is 3 years post-release back to a Department of Corrections. We're actually doing pretty well. As I mentioned before, we also don't supervise people when they're released from prison. So you've got 65% of people, including folks who have been in solitary confinement, walking out of our prisons onto the streets, and they're not being monitored. They probably won't get caught either as readily. So, and in terms of where we are in arrests, we're the same. I mean, obviously laws are different between states. Each community has different sentencing structures, so it's kind of hard to compare. But on average, we're getting terrible results for a very expensive and very invasive process of housing people in prisons and jails.
For anybody, do you think we need COPWATCH in every community?
I feel like I met the guy who probably asked this question. There certainly is a lot of value in knowing what our police are up to. And in the rare case where a police officer is actually prosecuted for some excessive force or excessive deadly force, in a great majority of those cases, you're going to find there will be video footage of this because it's irrefutable. For the longest time, and still in many cases, complaints about police misconduct and especially police brutality, it was the word of the suspected criminal versus the word of the police officer. And for reasons that we can probably imagine, many criminal suspects have previous records. They have criminal records. So when they go to court and try to sue, assuming they can get past immunity and all of these things, or even just taking their case to the public through the media, you have somebody who has a criminal record, and on the other side you have a police officer in uniform, sworn to serve and protect. I think the video camera, the ubiquity of our cameras is a great equalizer there. It's not perfect. As we've seen, even cases of severe police misconduct that look at everyone as if something horrible happened, even there it's still difficult to have accountability in our criminal justice system. But I absolutely think people have a constitutional right to know what their police are up to. They have a constitutional right to film it, and they have a constitutional right to broadcast it to the world. And as long as they're not interfering in what the police are legitimately trying to do, I'm absolutely a fan of efforts to record police in public.
Amen.
Next question, anyone?
I don't have a card, but could I say something? Just give me a minute, we'll get there. We've got a couple questions to get through.
If a student earns a degree in criminal justice, BS, AS, MS, or PhD, in the Florida higher educational system, are they more likely to support reform or more likely to maintain the status quo?
So, I'm just going to say this.
I only read the question.
My program is housed under the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, not criminology. Criminology, they do very intensive, deep dives, experimental stuff. We're the practical arm of that. I can't really speak to what they're learning. I just know that we are a better fit, I think, in working with the economics department and the public policy part of our group. So for me, I don't know. That's a really good question, though.
Yes, take it.
Thank you. My name is Susan, and I'm a mental health counselor, and I work at the jail, and I just want to give like a little healing faith to everything. I respect, what the folks are saying up there and all, but I just want to say that, we're all human, and all of us have issues, and all the people that I work with at the jail are very human beings with issues, and as human beings, we all have avoidance behaviors, and we all do things because we have discomfort. And,
There's gotta be a question now.
no, I don't have a question. I just
Well, that's what this is, a question period. Isn't it? Yeah. If there's a question at the end, I'll be glad to hear it.
I think she was just trying to share what her view is, working in this field.
Next question. Does the law allowing police to confiscate any material goods owned by an accused drug dealer incentivize otherwise dubious cases?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of work on civil asset forfeiture at Cato. It's a horribly abusive practice. I assume many of you have heard of it, but if you haven't, police can, in most jurisdictions still, if based on only the suspicion that you're engaged in some criminal activity, usually drugs, they can seize what they see as the instrumentalities of that criminal behavior. So if they suspect you of drug trafficking, that could be your car, it could be all of the cash in your pocket, it could be your PlayStation, it could be your house, it could be a hotel. You're not charged with a crime. It's just the mere suspicion allows them to invoke this civil asset forfeiture and take title to your property or your cash. I talked a lot about incentives tonight. Most of the time, civil asset forfeiture, the actual cash or the actual proceeds of the property they take goes back to the police department itself. It doesn't go to the legislature, it doesn't go in the general fund or to education, it goes right back to the budget of the agency that took your property. So we don't have to speculate that this perverse incentive for policing for profit results in bad cases. We know it does. And Cato, I've done a lot of work at Cato on this. The Institute for Justice has a report, it's now in its second edition, called Policing for Profit, that is an extensive detailing of civil forfeiture laws around the country and abuses. And if all of that is too much, John Oliver has a great bit that you can find on YouTube that's about 12 minutes long, and it's just 12 or 15 minutes of civil forfeiture abuses. But this is something that it should be very low-hanging fruit because it's fundamentally un-American that the government can just take your stuff without a charge or trial. But so I absolutely think we need to do away with this, and it should be, as I said, it should be low-hanging fruit in a free country.
Amen.
This question is a little long. Well, I'll try to read it first.
It's the last one.
It's the last one too. That's good news for some of us. The Koch Foundation and the Cato Institute are known for supplying free market solutions to societal ills. How do we prevent private industry from continuing to prey on our most vulnerable populations? Who will be the new beneficiary of criminal justice reform? The folks who make electronic monitors?
So I'm just going to say this, the prison industrial complex is alive and well, and the next wave will be the behavioral and substance abuse industrial complex. And so what we need to be doing is measuring, understanding what it is that we're asking for, which we don't do already, and monitoring the results. I mean, governments privatize and outsource things all the time. We can argue about it, but the fact is it's very much alive in Florida and certainly in the country.
Sure. I'll just say, as far as what I've advocated tonight and what I believe about what we need for criminal justice reform, I I mean, in some way, it's an argument for privatization in that I think whether you smoke marijuana is a private issue, not a public government issue that should be treated with the criminal justice system. But the beneficiaries of legalized drugs, I guess, are the manufacturers of drugs and the sellers and the customers who are no longer having their lives ruined and having their doors kicked in for drug use. Who are the beneficiaries of ending alcohol prohibition? We could spin that as some perverse conspiracy to enrich alcohol distributors, but I don't think that's not how we view legal alcohol. So I understand, and some abuses in the private prison system have made these legitimate questions to ask, certainly. But my big takeaway when I talk about getting rid of the drug war and getting rid of plea bargains or civil forfeiture, that's not the private parties that benefit from that are the people who are currently put in prison for these things. That's the private interests that benefit, are the people who are sitting in prison right now, which is what happens since we've let the government handle this problem. That's their solution. So I do think we should have a free market in drugs, not to benefit the lurking evil drug manufacturers, but because I think putting people in cages for this is stupid and evil, and I think we can prove it.
Well, I want to make just one comment before I call on Mr. McGuire. Ever sit at a dinner party and they say that damn ACLU they put, and what they did now, they can burn flags, or now on some issues, ACLU is bad. You've all seen that, right? I got a good retort for you. They're just the messenger. They don't decide the case. The judge is the bad guy in your view. Why are you yelling about the ACLU? It's the judge. But they forget that. It's like the old days, the messenger is killed when he brings bad news to the king. Now, yes, Tony?
Sorry to interrupt. I have two cars that need to be moved so others can get out of this enclosed parking area. A Camry DJNY 79 and an Honda Element 161QFL. If you have those license plates, I'd ask you to move those so that other people can move from that area.
Well, a last word from the big hitter from the ACLU. Raymond, come on up.
So I want to discuss the next steps. I don't think you need any more convincing that Florida needs criminal justice reform. So I'm going to list 5 things that you can do, starting with what you can do tonight, what you can do this month, and what I want you to do over the next year. So the first thing that I want you to do tonight is to sign the voter restoration petition that's out there. It is a major uphill battle getting this on the ballot. You need over 1 million petitions because so many are duplicates and filled out incorrectly. You need over 1 million petitions in Florida to make the ballot. And restoring the voting rights of 1.7 million Floridians that have had them taken away and have completed their sentences is very important, and it would greatly reduce recidivism. So please sign that petition tonight if you haven't already. The second thing is there's a sign-up sheet out there. You can get involved with your local ACLU chapter and volunteer on a local Naples and Collier County level. If you're not already receiving Collier County ACLU emails, if you're not already attending the meetings, please get involved. The real big thing that I want you to do is to contact your legislator this legislative session. They are in committee up through January and February, and they're going to only be in session in March and April and the first week of May. If your representatives do not hear from you, and do not feel that criminal justice reform is important to the community that they represent, they will not vote for it, and it will not pass this year. You might not think that your 10 minutes or 20 minutes for a phone call or writing a letter or drafting an email makes a big difference, but it does. When a legislator receives 100 calls in a day saying, this is a priority bill, this is a priority issue, their staff notices and the representatives notice, please, please, please. You can go to acluflorida.org and sign up for action alerts. We're going to be doing a contact your legislator every 2 weeks during the legislative session. We're going to provide talking points. We're going to provide contact information. And to be involved in that, you can just go to acluflorida.org, sign up for action alerts. We are also going to be bringing up representatives, volunteers, supporters, affected individuals to Tallahassee. If you're able to make that trip and you want to actually sit down with us and to speak with your legislators about these reforms, we'll provide training, we'll provide talking points, and I would ask for you to join us. You can, I think, contact Jeff, sign up on ACLU Florida, or just speak with me tonight for more information about joining us. And then lastly, if you think that you can help represent our campaign in Collier County, in your community, we have an ambassador program where we are training individuals that have a connection and a story to tell about the criminal justice system in Florida. And we're asking for affected individuals and community leaders to become campaign ambassadors. If you think that might be appropriate for you, I would love for you to flag me down after this event. And lastly, I just want to say thank you for being here tonight. Simply filling up this room and having so many people that were blocking in cars in this parking lot is amazing. And it shows me that this is a priority issue. And I just want to say thank you for all of your support and help.
Before I thank our panelists, I want to point out or recognize our 5 sponsoring organizations, the NAACP, the Naples Jewish Federation, Americans United, the ACLU, of course, and this wonderful Unitarian congregation that has given us so much, and the members of which have all been so very supportive of this. I'd like to, of course, give thanks, as we all want to, as we will in just a moment, to our wonderful panelists. I'm very heartened by the sophistication of what you had to say, and we're all aware of the power of your organizations. Deborah's organization, the universities, Raymond's organization, the ACLU, Cato, a very powerful organization, and the sophistication and intelligence and knowledge of you people is just very heartening, because we have people, if we have people like you leading the charge, we can get something done. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, thank you.